Hi, chemistry. We're continuing on with ionic compounds today, and we're going to talk about how to name them. So the basic premise of naming ionic compounds is pretty straightforward. We know that ionic compounds are made from a cation and an anion. And we know that the cations and the anions have been doubled or tripled or quadrupled in order to balance the charges of the cation and the anion so that the ionic compound comes out neutral. So when we name ionic compounds, the only thing we actually have to do is name the cation and then name the anion. When we're naming ionic compounds, we don't have to reference what we have had to do to double or triple the compounds at all. We don't have to reference the subscripts at all. We just have to name the cation and name the anion. For some compounds, this is extremely straightforward. Like this one, we know that this ionic compound has been made from the ion of lithium and the ion of fluorine put together. So we just name the two ions. The name of Li plus is the lithium ion. The name of F minus is not fluorine, but it's fluoride. It's the fluoride ion. So the name of this compound is lithium fluoride. In a similar way, this compound right here is made from the magnesium ion and the ion that comes from chlorine. So the name of this compound is the name of the cation, which is magnesium ion. We drop the ion, and then the name of Cl minus is chloride. So this compound is magnesium chloride. Notice I didn't have to indicate in the name at all that I doubled the chloride ion. You don't have to tell me that for ionic compounds, because if I know the charges, I can figure out what the subscripts are. So if you're given a compound name, like for example, if we're given the name strontium nitride, if you are given that name and you want to get to the formula, you have to go through a specific process where first you evaluate what ions you have, Sr2 plus, and nitride is N3 minus. And then second, you have to consider how many of each you need in order to balance the equation, right? In order to come out to 0, we need 3 strontiums and we need 2 nitrides. So I write Sr3 and 2. So going from the name to the formula can be a little tricky because you have to pause and consider what the charges are, how many of each you need in order to be balanced, and then write the formula. To go from formula to name, most of the time it's a little bit more straightforward. You just have to consider what ions are there and name them. Strontium nitride. Now, this can be, there are a couple skills involved in this. Like we said, you have to recognize the ion you're talking about. And this can be a little bit tricky when you get into polyatomic ions, which is why it's so very important for you to know the polyatomic ions, be familiar with them, memorize them so that you can look at a formula and recognize what's inside. For example, if we look at this compound right here, there's a lot of atoms present. So I need to be familiar enough with the atoms and the ions to be able to recognize them inside this compound. This compound is made of 2 things, the sodium ion and then this ion right here, which is acetate. So the name of this compound is sodium acetate. Now, recognizing those polyatomic ions definitely is a skill. It definitely takes some practice, and memorizing those polyatomic ions is the easiest way to go about making sure you can recognize them inside of compounds. We can do the same thing with this compound over here. This is an ionic compound, and it's made from NH4 plus, which is ammonium, and Cl minus, which is the chloride ion. So the name of that compound is ammonium chloride. I want to point out one example over here on the side. This example with sulfate, SO4 2 minus is sulfate. And notice it's paired up with this ion. Notice it's 2 ions of rubidium. So again, even recognizing those representative elements like the rubidium ion and knowing that it's 2 rubidium ions and not some polyatomic ion that's made out of Rb2, it's a skill, and memorizing those polyatomics is going to be helpful. Okay, so the trickiest ones to name, in my opinion, are the ones that involve the transition metals. So let me show you a couple of those. All of these in this middle row involve a cation that comes from a transition metal. So notice we have 3 of these coppers and we have a nitrate here. We have a tin and an oxygen. We have a lead and a fluorine. So you know that transition metals can form more than one ion. And when you name the transition metal ion, you have to tell me which charge you're dealing with. Well, that means before we can do that for these compounds, we need to stop and we need to consider what ion we're dealing with. So let's go through these examples. Okay, Cu3N. We know that copper can be a copper 2 or a copper 3. So in order to a copper 1 or a copper 2. So in order to decide which one we're dealing with, we want to look at the nitrogen. This nitrogen is nitride. Nitrogen only forms one ion, so we automatically know which one it's going to be. It's going to be N3 minus. That's the only option for nitrogen. So if I have an N3 minus and I have 3 of the charge, we can do a little investigating math and figure out what the charge of that copper is. So if I have 3 of a copper plus a 3 minus from the nitrogen, I know it's going to be a neutral compound. They're going to add up to 0. What does that charge in there? What must it be? It must be a 1 plus. And so now we know that's the copper 1 ion along with the nitride ion. So the name of that compound is copper 1 nitride. Again, just like all the other ionic compounds, notice I have not indicated how many of each ion are present. Remember that Roman numeral does not reference the subscripts. It references the charge. So it's the copper 1 nitride because that copper inside this compound has a 1 plus charge. So again, it's a little bit trickier because you have to figure out what the charges are before you can name them. Let's look at the tin example. So in this example, we have tin and oxygen together. We know oxygen automatically because oxygen only forms one charge. It's the 2 minus charge. So we have to figure out what the charge of tin is going to be. So we know we have 1 ion of each, 1 tin, 1 oxygen. So what charge of tin must be added to a 2 minus in order to get to 0? It's got to be a 2 plus charge. So that's going to be tin 2, because tin has a 2 plus charge. So the Roman numeral indicates the charge. Tin 2 oxide. Okay, you try it for lead. We know the charge of fluorine. Fluorine only forms 1 charge. Oops, not a 1 plus, a 1 minus. Okay, if you have 2 fluorines, so 2 of the 1 minus, what must the charge of lead be in order to be 0? It's got to be a 2 plus. So the name of that compound is going to be lead 2 fluoride. All right, so just to recap, in order to name ionic compounds, you have to first figure out charges, then name the cation, then name the anion, and together you have the name of the ionic compound. All right, let's practice this. Let me know what your questions are. I'll see you in class.